Per single mother counts her last coins on the flight, until a Mafia sitting nearby changes her life. The fluorescent lights of Gate 23B cast harsh shadows under Sarah Chen's eyes as she clutched her boarding pass with trembling fingers. 26 years old and looking 40, she pressed her lips into a thin line and adjusted the worn strap of her canvas bag. Inside, everything she owned in the world barely filled half the space. "Mommy, are we really going on the big airplane?" 7-year-old Emma tugged at her mother's faded jeans, her gap-toothed smile the only bright thing in Sarah's increasingly dark world. "Yes, baby. We're going to see Grandma Rose in Chicago." Sarah forced cheerfulness into her voice, though the words felt like swallowing glass. The truth was more complicated. They were running. Running from eviction notices, from David's drunken fists, from a life that had spiraled so far out of control that a one-way ticket bought with her last credit card seemed like salvation. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers. "Now boarding all passengers for Flight 847 to Chicago." Sarah's stomach nodded. She'd splurged on the tickets, if you could call using emergency credit card cash advances splurging, but hadn't eaten in 18 hours. Emma had managed half a gas station sandwich for breakfast, and that would have to last them the 4-hour flight. They shuffled forward in the boarding line, Emma's small hand warm and trusting in hers. Sarah tried not to notice the other passengers, businessmen in expensive suits checking their phones, families with multiple suitcases discussing dinner reservations, college students complaining about delayed luggage. Everyone seemed to belong to a world where missing meals was a choice, not a necessity. "Boarding passes and IDs, please." The gate agent's voice carried the practiced boredom of someone who'd seen 1,000 passengers that day. Sarah fumbled for their documents, her hands shaking slightly. Behind them, a man cleared his throat, not impatiently, just a quiet sound that somehow made her more aware of how long she was taking. "Here we go," she whispered to Emma as they walked down the jet bridge. The airplane loomed ahead, and for a moment, Sarah felt the old thrill she'd experienced as a child on her first flight. Before life had taught her that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. Their seats were near the back, 22C and 22D. Sarah lifted Emma into the window seat and took the middle, grateful that the aisle seat was empty. At least for now. As passengers continued boarding, Sarah pulled out her small coin purse. The metal was warm from being clutched so tightly. Inside, $3.47. She'd counted it 7 times in the terminal, hoping somehow the amount might magically increase. Emma pressed her nose against the window. "Mommy, look how tiny the cars are. The plane hasn't even moved yet, sweetie." Sarah managed a real smile this time. Emma's wonder was infectious, even in their darkest moments. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 847 to Chicago." The captain's voice filled the cabin. "We'll be in the air shortly, and flight attendants will begin beverage service once we reach cruising altitude." Beverage service. Sarah's mouth felt like sandpaper. Emma would be thirsty soon. She always got thirsty when she was excited or nervous. $3.47. Maybe enough for a small juice box or a cup of ice water with a splash of Sprite. The plane pushed back from the gate, and Sarah closed her eyes during takeoff, feeling the familiar weightlessness as they left the ground. When she opened them, a flight attendant was pushing a cart down the aisle. "Something to drink?" The attendant's smile was professional but kind. "Could we?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Could we get a small juice for my daughter? Apple juice if you have it?" "Of course. That'll be $4.50 each." $4.50. Sarah's heart sank. She looked down at her coins, then up at the attendant. "I'm sorry, I only have $3.47. Could we maybe get a water instead?" "Water's $3. Sarah counted out $3 in quarters, dimes, and nickels, her cheeks burning. The passenger in the aisle seat of the row ahead had turned slightly, not obviously watching, but aware. She could feel judgment radiating from the business travelers around them. "Actually," Sarah said quickly, "never mind. We're fine." The flight attendant's expression softened. "Are you sure?" "I could. We're fine," Sarah repeated, stuffing the coins back into her purse. Emma looked confused. Mommy, I thought you said I could have juice. Later, baby. When we get to Grandma's? As the cart moved on, Sarah stared at her hands. This was rock bottom, counting coins on an airplane while her daughter went thirsty. The man in the aisle seat across from them hadn't moved, but she could sense his attention like heat from a flame. He was reading a newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, but his eyes weren't tracking the words. Instead, they occasionally flicked toward her and Emma with an expression she couldn't quite read. His suit was immaculate but understated, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes. His hands were manicured, and he wore a watch that probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months at her old waitressing job. But it was his stillness that unnerved her. In a cabin full of restless passengers, he sat like a statue, breathing so quietly she wondered if he was holding his breath. When he finally turned a page of his newspaper, the movement was deliberate, controlled. Emma was getting restless, kicking her legs and starting to whimper, her usual precursor to asking for water. Sarah checked her watch. 2 hours left in the flight. 2 hours of watching her daughter grow more uncomfortable while she sat helpless, surrounded by people for whom $4.50 was pocket change. She'd never felt more alone. 30 minutes later, the meal service began. Sarah watched the flight attendant approach with a cart laden with sandwiches, crackers, and small bags of pretzels. Her stomach cramped audibly, and she pressed a hand to her midsection, hoping Emma hadn't heard. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Emma whispered, right on cue. Sarah's jaw clenched. She'd been dreading this moment since they boarded. "I know, sweetheart. We'll eat when we land. But that's a long time." Emma's voice carried that particular whine that meant tears weren't far behind. "My tummy hurts." The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper with practiced precision and set it in his lap. For the first time since takeoff, he looked directly at Sarah. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and completely unreadable. "What can I get for you folks?" The flight attendant stopped beside their row, her smile bright and expectant. Sarah's throat went dry. We're okay, thanks." "Are you sure? We have turkey and Swiss sandwiches, fruit and cheese boxes." "How much for the fruit and cheese?" Sarah interrupted, hope flickering despite herself. $8.50. The hope died. Sarah shook her head. "No, thank you." Emma's face crumpled. "But Mommy, you promised we could eat on the airplane. You said it would be an adventure." Every passenger within earshot was now listening. Sarah felt their stares like physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Her cheeks burned with shame that went deeper than embarrassment. This was the humiliation of failing as a mother in front of strangers. "Emma, please. I want the fruit box." Emma's voice rose to the edge of a tantrum. "You said we could have airplane food." The flight attendant glanced around uncomfortably. "Well, I could. Put it on my tab." The voice came from across the aisle, low and calm but carrying absolute authority. Sarah turned to stare at the businessman, her mouth falling open. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even leaned forward much, but somehow his words cut through the cabin noise like a blade through silk. The flight attendant immediately straightened, her posture shifting from helpful to deferential. "Of course, sir. 1 fruit and cheese box. And whatever the child wants to drink. Apple juice." Emma bounced in her seat, completely oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around her. Sarah found her voice. "No. No, we can't." The man's dark eyes fixed on hers, and the words died in her throat. "It's already done." There was something in his tone that made arguing seem not just futile but potentially dangerous. This wasn't kindness, this was control. A demonstration of power as casual as checking his watch. The flight attendant served Emma the fruit box and juice with unusual speed, then moved on without asking for payment. Sarah sat frozen, watching her daughter tear into the food with the desperate enthusiasm of genuine hunger. "Thank you, mister!" Emma called across the aisle, cheese cracker crumbs decorating her chin. "This is the best airplane food ever!" The ghost of a smile touched the corner of the man's mouth. "You're welcome." Sarah's hands clenched into fists in her lap. "I don't need your charity, she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. He picked up his newspaper but didn't open it. It's not charity. Then what is it? A transaction. The words sent ice through her veins. What kind of transaction? But he'd already returned to reading, effectively dismissing her. Sarah stared at his profile, the strong jawline, the perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Emma was chattering happily between bites, something about clouds looking like animals, but Sarah barely heard her. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Men like this, men in $1,000 suits who solved problems with quiet commands, they didn't help struggling mothers out of the goodness of their hearts. They wanted something. Mommy, aren't you going to eat? Emma held out a grape. Sarah accepted it mechanically, her eyes never leaving the man across the aisle. He seemed completely absorbed in an article about commodity futures, but she caught him glancing at Emma once, then twice. His expression was unreadable, but there was something calculating in those dark eyes. A transaction, he'd said? But what could she possibly have that a man like him would want? The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Sarah's hand instinctively went to her throat, where her grandmother's locket rested beneath her shirt. The chain was old and thin, bought at a pawn shop years ago, when she was young and foolish enough to think vintage jewelry might somehow make her feel less poor. When the turbulence passed, she realized the businessman was watching her again. This time, his gaze lingered on her hand at her throat. Mommy, can I color now? Emma had finished eating and was reaching for the small box of crayons in Sarah's bag. Of course, baby. As Emma settled in with her coloring book, Sarah snuck another look across the aisle. The man had set aside his newspaper and was staring out the window, but she could see his reflection in the glass. He wasn't looking at clouds or countryside. He was watching her. 20 minutes passed in relative quiet. Emma colored contentedly while Sarah tried to ignore the weight of the stranger's intermittent stare. The plane hummed steadily through clear skies, and she'd almost managed to convince herself that accepting his help had been a simple, if uncomfortable, act of kindness. Then the turbulence hit. The first jolt was mild, just enough to make passengers look up from their books and phones. But the second sent Emma's crayon box flying and had Sarah gripping her armrest with white knuckles. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some rough air. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The plane bucked again, more violently this time. Emma squeaked in alarm and grabbed for Sarah's arm just as the aircraft dropped suddenly, leaving Sarah's stomach somewhere near the ceiling. It's okay, baby. Sarah managed, though her own heart was hammering. It's just bumpy air. Another sharp drop, and this time the overhead compartments rattled. Sarah's hand flew instinctively to her throat, seeking the familiar comfort of her grandmother's locket, a habit she'd developed during stressful moments since childhood. But the thin gold chain had shifted during the turbulence. As the plane pitched forward, the locket slipped free from beneath her faded blue blouse, catching the cabin light as it swung against her chest. Across the aisle, the businessman went perfectly still. Sarah was too focused on comforting Emma to notice his reaction at first. The little girl had gone pale and was making small whimpering sounds that tore at Sarah's heart. Look at me, Emma. Just look at Mommy, okay? We're going to be fine. But even as she spoke, Sarah became aware of a change in the atmosphere around them. A tension that had nothing to do with the turbulent air. She glanced up to find the businessman staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. His newspaper lay forgotten in his lap. His hands, which had been so steady throughout the flight, now gripped the armrests of his seat. And his dark eyes were fixed not on her face, but on the locket at her throat. The turbulence began to ease, but the man's stare didn't waver. Sarah's free hand moved self-consciously to cover the pendant. That's an interesting piece of jewelry, he said quietly. His voice was different now, carefully controlled, but with an undercurrent Sarah couldn't identify. It wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite surprise. It was something colder. Thank you, Sarah replied cautiously, tucking the locket back beneath her shirt. May I see it? The request was polite, but there was nothing optional about his tone. Sarah's protective instincts flared. "I'm sorry." "The locket. I'd like to see it." Emma had calmed down and was reaching for her scattered crayons, oblivious to the strange conversation happening above her head. Sarah's mind raced. This man had already demonstrated his power over situations, his ability to command attention with just a few words. But asking to examine her jewelry crossed a line she wasn't comfortable with. "It's just an old family piece," she said carefully. "Nothing special." "I doubt that." His eyes never left her throat, even though the locket was now hidden. "Where did you get it?" The question was sharp, demanding. Sarah felt Emma tense beside her, finally picking up on the adult tension. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "Humor me." There was steel in those two words. Sarah glanced around the cabin, suddenly very aware that they were trapped in a metal tube 30,000 feet above ground with nowhere to run. The other passengers were reading, dozing, or staring at their phones. No one was paying attention to the quiet conversation across the aisle. Against her better judgment, Sarah pulled the locket out again, holding it against her palm but not removing it from around her neck. "There. Are you satisfied?" The man leaned forward, and for the first time since they'd boarded, his composure cracked. Sarah saw his jaw clench, saw something that might have been pain flash across his features before the mask slammed back into place. "Where did you get it?" he repeated, but his voice was rougher now. "A pawn shop in Detroit. About 8 years ago." Sarah's words came out clipped and defensive. "I bought it as a keepsake for my daughter when she was born. It cost me $40, which was more than I could afford at the time, but I thought." She trailed off, realizing how pathetic it sounded. The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those unreadable dark eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What pawn shop?" "Mickey's on Corktown." "Why does it matter?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through something with quick, precise movements. His breathing had changed, shorter, more controlled, like a man trying to contain an explosion. "That locket," he said finally, "is one of a kind. Handcrafted in Italy in 1987. There were only 2 ever made." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "That's impossible." The pawn shop owner said it was just old costume jewelry. The pawn shop owner lied. His eyes locked onto hers with laser focus. "I know because I commissioned both pieces. One for my wife." His voice dropped to barely audible. "And one for her sister." The plane continued its steady flight toward Chicago, but Sarah felt like she was falling through endless sky. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't chance. This was something much more dangerous. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Emma had returned to her coloring, humming softly to herself, creating a bizarre backdrop of childhood innocence against the growing tension. "Your wife," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "What happened to her?" The man's fingers drummed once against his armrest, the first fidgety movement she'd seen from him. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean across the aisle to hear him. "Her name was Isabella." He stared past Sarah toward the window, but his eyes seemed focused on something much further away than clouds. "We met in Chicago, actually. She was everything I wasn't. Light where I was dark. Laughter where I was silence." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the airplane's air conditioning. The way he spoke about Chicago, about his wife, this wasn't the casual conversation of strangers on a plane. This was confession. "She knew what I was," he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "What I did for a living. The kind of man who could afford to commission one-of-a-kind lockets from Italian jewelers. She said she didn't care, that love was stronger than fear." "What do you do?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. His dark eyes flicked to hers, and in them she saw something that made her understand why people might cross streets to avoid him, why flight attendants jumped to obey his quiet commands. I solve problems for people who can't solve them themselves, he said simply. Sometimes those solutions require creativity. The euphemism hung in the air between them. Sarah's mouth went dry, but she found herself leaning closer instead of pulling away. There was something hypnotic about his quiet intensity, the way grief and danger seemed to war in his expression. The lockets were an anniversary gift, he continued. 5 years of marriage. Isabella cried when I gave it to her. Said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever owned. His jaw tightened. What I didn't know was that she'd already been planning to leave me for months. Emma looked up from her coloring book. Mommy, can I have more juice? In a minute, baby, Sarah murmured, her attention completely absorbed by the man across the aisle. Her sister Maria was supposed to be my ally, he went on, his voice growing colder. Family loyalty, you understand. But Isabella had been feeding information to the FBI through Maria for almost a year. Names, locations, business arrangements. Everything she'd learned from pillow talk and overhead conversations. Sarah's blood chilled. FBI. She was sitting next to a man the federal government had been investigating, a man whose wife had been an informant. Emma's innocent humming seemed to come from another world entirely. I found out 2 days before they planned to arrest me, he said. Came home early from a business trip and overheard Isabella on the phone with her handler. She was laughing, Sarah. Laughing about how easy it had been to fool the dangerous criminal with sweet words and warm kisses. The plane hit another small patch of turbulence, but neither of them seemed to notice. What did you do? Sarah whispered. His smile was knife-sharp. Nothing. That was my mistake. I thought love meant forgiveness, even for betrayal. I confronted her, told her I knew, gave her a chance to explain. He paused, his hands clenching into fists. She tried to run. Took the car in the middle of the night with Maria and the evidence they'd gathered. They never made it to the FBI field office. Sarah felt sick. You killed them. No. The word came out like a gunshot. My enemies did. The Torino family had been watching me for months, waiting for an opportunity to strike. When they learned about Isabella's cooperation with the FBI, they saw their chance. Made it look like I'd discovered the betrayal and eliminated the witnesses myself. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she recognized all too well, the look of a person who'd lost everything that mattered. The FBI believed it. My own organization believed it. And for 8 years I let them. It was easier than admitting the truth, that I'd been too weak to protect the woman I loved from my own world. Emma tugged at Sarah's sleeve again. Mommy, the nice man looks sad. Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah glanced at her daughter, then back at the man who just confessed to being someone the FBI had once hunted. She should be terrified. Should be planning her escape the moment they landed, figuring out how to disappear with Emma before this dangerous stranger could change his mind about his generosity. Instead, she found herself studying the grief etched into his features, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly when he spoke about Isabella's laugh. She recognized that particular brand of devastation, the kind that came from loving someone who destroyed you. You're not afraid of me, he observed quietly. Sarah considered the question seriously. I should be. But you're not. No, she touched her locket through her shirt. You're not the first dangerous man I've known. But you might be the first honest 1-inch. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition. You remind me of her, he said softly. Not Isabella. The woman I thought she was. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The captain's announcement cut through their conversation like a blade, bringing Sarah crashing back to reality. In less than 30 minutes, this strange, dangerous encounter would be over. She'd walk off the plane with Emma, take a taxi to her grandmother's tiny apartment on the south side, and try to build some kind of life from the ashes of everything that had fallen apart. If Grandma Rose would even let them stay. Sarah's stomach knotted as she remembered their last phone call. The old woman's voice had been thin with disappointment, and barely concealed anger. You made your bed, Sarah. Don't come crying to me because it's uncomfortable to lie in. But where else could they go? The domestic violence shelter had a waiting list. Her credit cards were maxed. She had no friends left in Detroit. David had seen to that, systematically isolating her from anyone who might have helped. You're running from something, the man said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah's head snapped up. She'd been so lost in worry that she'd forgotten he was watching her. What makes you say that? One-way tickets bought with emergency credit. No luggage except a carry-on bag. The way you count every penny like it might be your last. His dark eyes seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. And the bruise on your wrist you keep trying to hide. Instinctively, Sarah tugged her sleeve down further. She'd thought the yellowing mark was completely covered. It's not what you think, she said automatically, then stopped herself. Why was she protecting David even now? It's exactly what I think. His voice carried a quiet certainty that made her shiver. How long? 3 years. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. But he never hurt Emma. I made sure of that. By taking the hits yourself. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked down at her hands, at the faded white line across her knuckles where David had slammed her fingers in a door during one of his rages. A mother does what she has to do. Yes, he said softly. She does. The plane continued its descent, and Sarah could see the sprawl of Chicago coming into view below them. Somewhere down there was a grandmother who might slam the door in their faces. A city where they knew no one, had no resources, no safety net. I want to make you an offer, the man said suddenly. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of offer? The kind that ensures Emma never goes hungry again. The kind that puts her in the best schools, gives her opportunities you could never afford. The kind that means no man will ever raise a hand to either of you again. The words hung in the air like a golden promise and a serpent's whisper all at once. Sarah felt her heart racing. I don't even know your name, she whispered. Vincent. Vincent Torino. He paused, watching her face. And before you ask, yes, I'm one of those Torinos. The ones you've probably seen in newspaper headlines and FBI press releases. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even she, with her limited knowledge of organized crime, had heard whispers about the Torino family. They weren't just dangerous, they were legendary in their ruthlessness. You're offering to help us, she said slowly. But what do you want in return? Vincent's smile was razor sharp. Your honesty. Your loyalty. Your trust. He leaned forward slightly. I've spent 8 years surrounded by people who lie to my face and scheme behind my back. You're the first person I've met in all that time who looks at me and sees something worth saving. I never said. You didn't have to. It's in your eyes. The same look Isabella used to give me before she decided I was a monster worth destroying. Emma had finished her coloring and was now pressing her face against the window, watching the city grow larger beneath them. Sarah's chest tightened as she imagined trying to explain to her daughter why they might be sleeping in a shelter, why there might not be enough food, why Mommy couldn't keep her safe from the world's cruelties. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked. A house in Lake Forest. Security that no one can breach. Emma in the best private school in Illinois. A trust fund that will ensure her future no matter what happens to either of us. Vincent's voice was hypnotic in its certainty. All you have to do is say yes. And the cost? His expression darkened. You become part of my world. You learn its rules, accept its necessities. Some nights I'll come home with blood on my hands, and you'll pretend not to see it. Some days men with guns will stand outside your door, and you'll smile and wave like their garden statuary. Sarah felt cold despite the cabin's warmth. You're asking me to become complicit in whatever you do. I'm asking you to be practical. Your daughter is 7 years old and deserves better than counting coins for juice boxes. What has your moral high ground gotten you so far? The brutal honesty of the question cut deep because Sarah couldn't argue with it. Her principles hadn't kept them fed or safe or housed. Her determination to do things the right way had led them to this airplane, fleeing toward an uncertain future with empty pockets and desperate hopes. Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for landing. Time was running out. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump that jolted Sarah from her spiraling thoughts. She'd spent the entire descent staring out the window, Vincent's offer echoing in her mind like a broken record. Security. Safety. A future for Emma that didn't involve food banks and second-hand clothes. But at what cost to her soul? We're here! Emma bounced in her seat as the plane taxied toward the gate. Chicago! Can we see Grandma Rose now? Soon, baby. Sarah's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. She glanced across the aisle, expecting to find Vincent gathering his things, preparing to disappear into the anonymous crowd like any other passenger. Instead, he was watching her with that same intense focus, as if memorizing every detail of her face. You haven't given me an answer, he said quietly. I haven't decided yet. Time's up. The plane lurched to a stop at the gate, and the familiar chaos of passengers gathering their belongings began. Sarah stood on shaky legs and pulled their small bag from the overhead compartment. Emma was chattering excitedly about seeing the tall buildings, completely oblivious to the life-altering conversation that had just taken place above her head. Vincent stood as well, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. He adjusted his suit jacket and slipped his phone into his pocket, every movement economical and purposeful. Sarah expected him to nod politely and disappear into the crowd ahead of them. He didn't. Instead, he waited while she gathered Emma's crayons and coloring book, while she helped her daughter with her small backpack, while they shuffled slowly toward the exit with the rest of the passengers. He followed 3 steps behind them, silent as a shadow. Mommy, is the nice man coming with us? Emma asked as they walked up the jet bridge. No, sweetheart. He's going to his own family. But when they emerged into the bright bustle of O'Hare's Terminal 3, Sarah realized how wrong she was. 3 men in dark suits stood near the gate, their eyes scanning the deplaning passengers with professional alertness. They weren't trying to blend in, quite the opposite. Their presence was a statement, a declaration of power that made other travelers unconsciously give them a wider berth. When Vincent appeared, all 3 men straightened. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. This wasn't coincidence or courtesy. This was organization. This was control extending far beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. Mr. Torino. The largest of the 3 men nodded respectfully. Car's waiting. Vincent acknowledged them with a slight nod, then turned to Sarah. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Emma skipped between them, still chattering about airplanes and tall buildings, while Sarah felt like she was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. They moved through the terminal like a small parade, Vincent's men creating an invisible bubble of space around them. Other travelers seemed to sense something. Danger, authority, the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself, and moved aside without conscious thought. Near the baggage claim, Vincent stopped. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope, cream-colored paper that felt expensive even before Sarah touched it. Regardless of your decision, he said, pressing it into her hands, this is yours. Sarah's fingers trembled as she felt the thickness of it. I can't. You can. You will. His dark eyes searched her face. That locket around your neck belonged to a woman I thought I knew. A woman who turned out to be an illusion. He paused, his voice growing softer. But you remind me that not everything I lost is gone. Emma tugged at Vincent's sleeve. Are you sad again, mister? Mommy says when people are sad, hugs help. Something cracked in Vincent's carefully controlled expression. He knelt down to Emma's level, and for a moment, the dangerous man vanished, replaced by someone who looked heartbreakingly human. Thank you, little one, he said gently. But I think I'm going to be okay. He stood and met Sarah's eyes one last time. The offer stands. My number is in the envelope, along with enough cash to give you choices. Real choices. He stepped back, his men closing ranks around him. Whether you call me or not, your life has already changed, Sarah. The question is whether you'll let it change for the better. And then he was walking away, disappearing into the crowd with his silent guardians flanking him like a presidential detail. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the busy terminal, holding the envelope and her daughter's hand. People flowed around them like water around stones, businessmen heading to meetings, families reuniting, travelers beginning new adventures. She looked down at Emma, who was watching Vincent's retreating figure with curious eyes. Mommy, was he a good guy or a bad guy? Sarah touched the locket at her throat, feeling its weight against her skin. In her other hand, the envelope seemed to burn with possibility and peril in equal measure. I don't know, baby, she whispered. I honestly don't know. But as they walked toward the exit, toward whatever waited for them in Chicago, Sarah knew Emma's question was the wrong one entirely. The real question wasn't whether Vincent was good or bad. The real question was what kind of person she was willing to become.